The Iron Curtain. In 1946, Winston Churchill warned about an Iron Curtain dividing Europe. This meant the split between Western democracies and Eastern communist countries. It marked the start of the Cold War, with Europe divided into two rival camps. The Truman Doctrine. President Truman introduced the Truman Doctrine in 1947, promising to help countries resist communism. This policy started America's long-term goal of stopping the spread of Soviet influence, especially in places like Greece and Turkey. The Berlin Blockade. The Berlin Blockade was one of the first major crises of the Cold War. In 1948, the Soviet Union blocked all land routes into West Berlin, trying to force the Allies to abandon the city. In response, the US and its allies organized the Berlin Airlift, flying in food and supplies for over a year. The blockade ultimately failed, but it highlighted the growing tensions and the determination of both sides to hold their ground. The Korean War. The Korean War began in 1950 when North Korea, supported by the Soviet Union and China, invaded South Korea. The US and its allies defended South Korea, leading to a stalemate. The war left Korea divided and highlighted the global reach of Cold War tensions. The Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 was arguably the most dangerous moment of the Cold War. When the US discovered Soviet missile in Cuba, tensions soared as the world feared a potential nuclear war. After tense negotiations between President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev, the crisis was diffused with the Soviet Union agreeing to remove the missile. This event was a turning point, leading to improved communication between the superpowers to prevent future confrontations. The space race. The space race was a competition between the US and the Soviet Union for space exploration. It began with the Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957, the first artificial satellite, and ended with the US landing on the moon in 1969 with Apollo 11. The race wasn't just about technology, it was about showing off each country's power. The Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was another Cold War conflict where the US tried to stop the spread of communism. Despite massive involvement, the US couldn't stop North Vietnam from taking over the South. The war ended in 1975, leaving a deep impact on America and its foreign policy. The Prague Spring. In 1968, Czechoslovakia tried to introduce more freedoms during the Prague Spring, led by Alexander Dubček. But the Soviet Union quickly crushed this movement, showing that it wouldn't allow any challenge to its control in Eastern Europe. Détente. The 1970s saw a temporary easing of Cold War tensions, known as Détente. This period was marked by efforts to reduce the risk of nuclear war, including arms control agreements like the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks SALT. However, this period of peace didn't last long. The Soviet-Afghan War. The Soviet-Afghan War started in 1979 when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. They faced strong resistance from Afghan fighters, supported by the US. The war dragged on for 10 years, weakening the Soviet Union and contributing to its eventual collapse. The Solidarity Movement in Poland. The rise of the Solidarity Movement in Poland during the 1980s was a significant challenge to Soviet control in Eastern Europe. Led by Lech Walesa, Solidarity was the first independent labor union in a Soviet bloc country. This labor union fought for workers' rights and more freedom, inspiring other Eastern European countries to resist Soviet influence. The Strategic Defense Initiative. In 1983, President Reagan proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative, a plan to build a missile defense system that aimed to protect the US from nuclear attacks by intercepting missiles in space. While the project wasn't completed, it increased pressure on the Soviet Union and contributed to the arms race. The Reykjavik Summit. In 1986, US President Reagan and Soviet leader Gorbachev met in Reykjavik, Iceland. Although the summit ended without an agreement, it marked a significant thaw in US-Soviet relations and laid the groundwork for future arms control agreements. The talks highlighted the growing willingness on both sides and led to future arms reduction deals, bringing the Cold War closer to its end. The fall of the Berlin Wall. In 1989, the Berlin Wall, which had divided East and West Berlin since 1961, was torn down by jubilant crowds, marking a powerful moment of unity and freedom. The fall of the wall signaled the failure of the Soviet Union to maintain control over its satellite states and the beginning of the reunification of Germany. The dissolution of the Soviet Union. The Cold War effectively ended in 1991 when the Soviet Union dissolved. This marked the end of the global conflict between the US and the Soviet Union, leaving the US as the world's only superpower.